With this story, I boldly go where no fantasy story has gone before and delve into that most uninvestigated of tropes, the heroic bookkeeper. Here we will see the mighty accountant in his full glory, with just a little help from bountifully bicepted barbarians, bloodthirsty bandits, and beneficent bankers. Truly, this story has everything you never wanted, including possibly the worst Australian accent ever recorded, because who doesn't want to offend an entire continent? Please let me know what you think in the comments, and should you subscribe, I'd appreciate it. For now, let the story begin. Darkelshank the Magnificent. In the way of many young men, Darkelshank considered himself the cleverest man alive, or at least in the city of Fund. He went to bed every night, confident the world would one day pay homage to Darkelshank the Magnificent, particularly the brutes and ruffians who teased and mocked the bookkeeper. Muscular nitwits may trip him, make jokes about him, and embarrass him before young ladies, but Darkelshank played with the ledgers as a cat plays with a mouse, and he had the beginnings of a fortune set aside. One day he would have power too, and his tormentors would become his worshippers. On the 17th day of month, in the year 4078, opportunity reached out its scaly fingers to him and beckoned. Fund was a city of wealth. Merchants and bankers lived in palaces fine enough for royalty, bathed in luxury, and entertained by wizards immersing them in any illusion they wished. A tsunami of trade brought the city gold and silver as caravans assaulted its gates and ships poured wealth into its vaults. The tailors of Fund weaved the finest cloth, while its other industries prospered under the most disengaged of governments. The Merchant Council ruled Fund and viewed the word tax as a blasphemy. So, brilliantly painted purple, red, and green towers of commerce adorned the sprawling city of 500,000. From these technicolor pinnacles, traders directed their empires of commerce. The riches flowed among the major roads, kept in perfect condition. Few of the tributary streets even had patches of paving. All Fund's residents worked for the connected. Profligate prosperity was proudly presented. Those that weren't rich were unimportant, particularly to men like Darkelshank, with eyes focused on their own advancement. The poor lived along dirt roads carefully distant from the heart of the city. It was easy for him to avoid looking down those stagnant tributaries and considering the sad stories which flowed along them. The city militia was lax, but massive walls protected its wealth. These stone sentinels soared 40 feet high and 3 feet thick. Their surfaces were adorned with murder holes, and their tops carried a variety of machines designed to frustrate the most persistent assault. Fund's vast warehouses and springs made besieging it a futile notion, guaranteed to impoverish an army. The city stood invulnerable. Except from within, and on that fateful day, Darkelshank smelled victory. There was a whisper, an expression of desire straining the heart of paradise. The people wanted a king. The Merchant Council addressed us the way they did the most uncomfortable notions. They ignored it. Fund had a millennia-long tradition of prophets who reliably warned of attacks, droughts, increased tolls, and other maladies. Zurin was the current leading visionary. His visions were rare, but Funtians considered them flawless. Most importantly, Zurin's own vision was non-existent, as he was born with sightless eyes. Darkelshank managed the ledgers for the merchant house responsible for Zurin's guards. Opportunity waved its wrinkled hips at the bookkeeper. Who could resist such seduction? Not Darkelshank. He planned to be Zurin's evening guard for a month. During the days, he worked his master's books assiduously, careful to never miss an opportunity to reroute a penny into his own accounts. During the nights, he whispered into Zurin's ear. The bookkeeper subsisted on naps and dreams of what he would do with Fund's riches. No land would stand before the army of Darkelshank. His name would rebound throughout the ages, and for those who had mocked him in the past for being portly, nearsighted, or clumsy, there would be a reckoning. None of them injured, but they'd all see how wrong they were about the bookkeeper. He would be the all-conquering hero. and all humanity would rejoice in his wise and benevolent rule. Darkelshank loved these dreams, clinging to them dauntlessly as he avoided considering what would happen if anyone attacked Zern while he was on guard duty. A week went by, then a month, then two. Was Zern impervious to suggestion? Finally, the prophecy came out in the 5th of Nunk of the year 4078. On the first day of the festival of the Founder, in the year 4880, the city will be reborn. Funt will receive a wise king through the silver gate at sunrise. He will be the first man through the gate, bringing in an age of wonder. There were screams of joy, particularly in the poorer quarters. Darkelshank suppressed his mirth. His master worried that a king would misuse the city's prosperity, and Darkelshank made a show of being smitten with fear, a role he played magnificently. The merchant set the bookkeeper free to seek his fortune elsewhere. Unaware, Darkelshank had already acquired comfortable wealth, sweeping up the crumbs of commerce from his master's table. Before he left the city, he surreptitiously purchased the finest set of clothes he could find and carefully boxed those away. With his future set, Darkelshank left for 2 years of considering how he would manage the city in its current ledgers once he returned. He also studied the libraries throughout the region, learning theories of military science and that darkest of arts, taxation. Funt's bane awaited his inevitable coronation. While he was away, the merchant council grew worried. They had no notion of Darkelshank's play, but the thought of change, particularly a change of government, was unsettling, and they adored being settled. So they made their own plans and preparations. A figurehead king could be a useful thing for them, but a king with actual power? A horror beyond their imagination, and one they could prevent with the slightest of efforts. Exactly the sort of effort they excelled in. The night before the prophesied day arrived, involving little sleep for Darkelshank. He had purchased a body servant a month ago, but Zoof was proving to be of little worth and woke him late. The plan had been to be 5 minutes from the gate an hour before dawn, but between the late start and the very slow dressing, he was behind schedule. Did Zoof have to stab him 5 times getting the pendants in his breast? Perhaps he shouldn't have hired a servant who reminded him so much of himself. Darkelshank also lost a few moments enjoying the clothing. The cloth caressed his body, fondling his limbs and embracing him as he'd never been embraced. He studied himself in his hand mirror, waving it about to enjoy every inch of his new aspect. He appreciated the impact of his purple top hat, deepened by azure and orange tunic and pants. The burgundy shoes were stylish, if awkward with their 6-inch toes. The clothing whispered, "Darkelshank is wonderful," and he believed it. Oh, the clothes he would don as king. In a fit of generosity, or perhaps self-preservation, Darkelshank freed Zoof as they broke camp. Confident better servants awaited him. He gave Zoof a small stake and pointed him away from Funt, lest the new freeman inadvertently enter his service. Despite these delays, Darkelshank was still atop his pearly stallion before sunrise and riding forward to destiny as the dark of night faded. As he closed on Funt, he noticed a child walking ahead of him, almost at the gate. The child had long blonde hair, wore a leather cuirass and breeches, and had a long object that dangled across the middle of his back. On closer inspection, he noticed that the child had massive arms, and Darkelshank suspected an unfortunate mutation. It would not do to arrive after such a misshapen youth, a harbinger of bad luck to come. Darkelshank spurred his horse, and it leapt forward, throwing the former bookkeeper to the ground. Dirt filled his mouth and stars his head, but destiny was not face down on the ground. He stood up, dusted himself off, just in time to hear a cheer fill the air. "Long live King Ak!" Darkelshank rode through the gates only 3 minutes after Ak, but it might as well have been a decade. Ak was no child. This was a weathered barbarian warrior, carrying the trademark two-handed broadsword used by the Huguenot nation. Rather than soft, boyish hands, Ox were weather-worn and showed the blisters of many battles. Ark's chest was larger than Darkelshank's stallion's, and muscle showed on every visible surface of his body, save for his clean-shaven face. The sun struck Ark's porcelain teeth, and Darkelshank winced in pain. Darkelshank saw a brute, exactly the type of man who had made his life miserable, aside from Ark being 4 feet tall. Midget bullies had been a rarity in Darkelshank's experience, but Ark must be an exception. Ark turned from the crowd and greeted Darkelshank with an extended hand. "Butter here, matey," Ark said. "These people appear to have proclaimed me a king or some such rubbish. Seems like nonsense to me, but if this town needs a top copper, I reckon there's worse to do it than me." Darkelshank fumed as they shook hands. This was obviously an uneducated barbarian, a soldier of fortune who earned his way hacking at his enemy's knees. Now this fool had stolen the crown of Funt. Darkelshank should kill him right this minute. And he would as soon as he could extract his hand from the ruffian's lion jaw grasp. "Sorry about that, mate. I forgets about me grip. Look, best I can tell, they've got some prophecy telling them I'm the king because I come through the gate. Bunch of bollocks, no doubt. The way I look at it, with just a little luck, it could have been you instead of me." The pain pounding in Darkelshank's hand kept time with the anger pulsing through his heart. "So I've been thinking you might be a good one to have on board. I mean, I've never been much for fate, but it seems to have taken a turn in me favor. So I'm thinking I'd best ride this rue and see where it takes me. You have a look of money about you, and I ain't never had much of that. What you say? You think you could help an old bogan out?" All those nights whispering in the prophet's ear, all that money embezzled, all that time studying to be a king, all for naught. "Look, mate, if you ain't helping, just say so. Buddy, no hard feelings." As the pain faded, Darkelshank's vision cleared. If he couldn't be king himself, he could do just as fine as the right-hand man to an idiot monarch. And who knew what opportunities would present themselves? "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "I didn't understand you at first. Of course I'll help. Darkelshank's the name, and I'm your man. I'll be right behind you all the way." That was when the crowd fell silent and began receding, pulling back toward their houses. "Hey, don't suppose you got a home guard here?" Ox said. "You mean militia? Righto. Best call them out. I reckon we'll be needing their help." At the gate, a few men dressed in red leather armor stood with crossbows pointed at the city guard. Behind them rode 200 scarlet-clad mounted warriors with lances dipped, shields at their side, and porous smiles displaying a devastating joy. In the center rode a troll of a man on a horse the size of an immature rhino. On his helm he wore a wolf's head, and his name invoked terror among respectable men throughout the world. This was Tarluk the Terrible, pillager of villagers, ravager of roadways, and devourer of virtue. "I claim my throne," Tarluk said. "It is good of so many of you to have come to greet me. I will be happy to kill as many of you as I must, to take that which is now mine." Tarluk flashed a mustard smile, pulling his lance and preparing for battle as did most of his horsemen. As he came forward, a scent like dead raccoon preceded him. "We ain't having none of that," Ox said, hauling his sword from the scabbard across his back. It was at least 6 feet long and must have weighed over 30 pounds. For now he parked the blade over his right shoulder and turned to face the crowd as Tarluk's men came to a halt. "Come on, those of you that fight with me today are me true cobbers. We stand together. We might just bleed together, but we can show these hooligans the door. This is your day. Stand beside me and stand proud. I ain't been your king for long, but king I be. Let's lick these rotters out of our city." The crowd stopped retreating and stood in place. Here and there swords and spears came out, along with frying pans and kitchen knives. They did not move forward, and their weapons trembled in their hands. The Funtians glimpsed destiny, but they were not ready to seize them. Tarluk laughed. All his men guffawed. Their horses strode forward a few steps. Then they stopped. Ock turned and dropped into an in-guard position, holding his massive blade in a perfect line in front of him, with his left arm in the air behind him. "Rack off!" Ock yelled, and the blade began to oscillate in his freakish right arm while the rest of his body locked into place. First side to side, then in an oblong motion, finally in figure eights, all the time picking up speed. Faster and faster it moved, eventually all but vanishing from sight. The broadsword produced a wind, and it struck the usurper with the first whisper of doubt. At the same time, the blade's movement produced a droning noise, sounding like a very large and furious bumblebee. "Have at him!" Ock charged forward, thrusting the bee's stinger at Tarlok. The blade continued to move, not as quickly, but with the relentless rhythm of a dog's tail as it gazes upon its master. Tarlok reacted as any would before such a crazed force of nature. He pulled back, but there was no room for retreat. He positioned his lance and shield, tiny sticks of wood, before Ock's inferno. The broadsword cut the head off the spear, then whacked it again, throwing the shaft into Tarlok's right-hand man. Ock stepped in, barely avoiding decapitating the luckless horse while sending Tarlok's shield flying into his entourage. Finally, Ock grabbed the horse's bridle with his left hand and drove the blade into Tarlok's neck with his right. In a heartbeat, Ock almost vanished atop the enormous horse as he pushed across it to attack the bandit behind the late warlord. Working from mount to mount with his blade slicing through weapons, armors, and flesh, the mighty midget was almost 3 ranks deep into the gang. Darkelshank felt a moment of hope. If the bandits had the wits to collapse in on Ock, he would be doomed. Fast blade or not, Ock could not fend off an attack from all sides at once, and Funt might be in the market for a new king. Then the inexplicable happened. Against all reason, there was a howl from the Funtians, and they charged in an expression of bloodlust such as had never occurred amongst shopkeepers, tavern owners, and stable hands. Enraged citizens waved pottery, skillets, and aprons as they fell on the bandits. Ock's name was on every Funtian's lip as 10,000 city dwellers cried for the blood of the would-be desperados. Soldiers will tell you that one armed man is worth 100 civilians, and Tarlok's men were veterans of countless ambushes. But between the miniature swordsman and his 10,000 maniacs, they decided they wanted no part of this fight. Fighting one crazed man was alarming. Fighting 10,000 was not the outlaw way. The bandits wheeled in unison and rode, escaping the 4-foot man and his spinning 6-foot broadsword as quickly as possible. In defiance of all logic, Ock and the citizens of Funt pursued the bandits for a mile outside of town. At that point, it must have occurred to the king that he'd made his point, and he stopped. The mob caught up with him in a minute. Once Darkelshank witnessed the bandits retreating, he'd saddled up and trotted after Ock, carefully not overtaking him. A couple more falls off the horse helped maintain the distance. The bookkeeper positioned himself at the front of the crowd and dismounted to be the first to congratulate the king. Darkelshank noticed his marvelous clothes had been ruined by the excitement of the morning, but he was prepared to be philosophical. Great opportunity comes at great cost. Darkelshank had little difficulty persuading Ock that he was just the man to study and organize the kingdom's finances while the king toured the city and introduced himself to his subjects. The new royal treasurer listened to tales of Ock's progress with amusement. He spent most of his time on the dirty side streets and in the poor quarters of the city, where Ock would have been feted extravagantly by the merchants and bankers at every turn. He took most of his meals at family homes and taverns. This did not look like a man prepared to be king. The right connections were everything to a ruler. Supposedly, Ock had even spent a few hours secluded with Zurn looking for a fortune-telling. Darkelshank winced at the foolishness. Ock had been sure it would take Darkelshank months to understand the city government's finances, but 2 weeks were more than enough to shock the treasurer into submission. The books were straightforward. There was little revenue, with funds collected on a variety of small fees on things such as food and water. Funt collected taxes with the efficiency of cats building a pyramid, and tax collectors focused on graft rather than any notion of civic duty. Where a great merchant had a food warehouse with 10,000 talents of food, carrying a tax burden of 100 talents, he would pay 20 and another 20 in bribes. Tax collection was a superb career choice that could be the first step to wealth. Unfortunately, the Merchant Council maintained tight control of the hiring processes and required an initiation fee of 1,000 talents, 20 times the annual income of a small shop. Most of the tax collectors were the children of merchants, usually the ones not clever enough to run the family business. Fortunately, city expenses were also trivial. The city maintained a small militia and used some of its revenue for maintenance of the walls and roadways. However, the collected taxes were insufficient for even these needs, and the city carried a debt of 100,000 talents, equivalent to 10 years of the government's annual income. So long as the merchant city controlled the city, the debt was no problem. But with a king in place, this might not be so simple. Worse, in the past year, the Merchant Council had multiplied the debt and ensured that all bonds landed in the hands of council members, positioning a golden dagger at the throat of the new monarch. Darkelshank realized that he had been fortunate to be the second man through the gates on the day of prophecy. The city had a palace which it kept for visiting royalty. This was turned over to the new king, but with little furniture. Ak had no royal bed, yet appeared content to rest on his traveling blanket. Room upon room lay vacant, save for the occasional table with uneven legs, and chairs sturdy enough to hold a poorly fed child. The royal palace also lacked staff, but the number of people volunteering to help Ak astonished Darkelshank. Food appeared from nowhere, not the quality served at the better tables in town, but filling and sustaining. There was one fine piece of furniture, a holdover from the distant past when Font had a king. An elephantine throne sat at the head of the reception hall. Leading up to the throne was a frayed fern-colored runner covering most of the 100-foot length of the hall. It was here that the king and the royal treasurer met. Ak wisely avoided the throne and instead sat at a table in chairs which had recently arrived from one of his plebeian benefactors. Darkelshank walked Ak through the finances in half an hour. The king asked questions which cut through the efforts Darkelshank made to soften the crisis. As the true situation came out, Ak emitted grunts which alternated between expressions of pain and anger. Toward the end of the briefing, Darkelshank saw Ak differently. The man had the build of a short gorilla. No way anything came easily to him. Ak was not at all like the boys who tortured Darkelshank. Chances were the barbarian had been in the same boat. Where Darkelshank had turned to his talent with numbers, Ak had invested in his arms. "Well, mate, I'm looking at a bloody mess, no doubt about it. The merchant got me caged up good and proper, or so they think. What do you think I should do?" A reasonable man would suggest caution and compromise at this point. Darkelshank had thought about this moment for much of the past 2 weeks. He considered advising reckless revolution and hoping that Ak failed. Temptation beckoned down that path. But Ak didn't deserve that, and Darkelshank didn't deserve to be the type of person who would betray his king. So he spoke his truth. "There's no choice, Your Highness. We must work with the Merchant Council to come up with a plan to ease the debt. Up the water tax, levy fees on foreign merchants, maybe see what I can pry out of taverns, that sort of thing." "All excellent ideas, Your Majesty," Darkelshank said, feeling hope for his new sovereign for the first time. Ak could make a fine figurehead, and treasurer offered many chances to join the graft caravan. Safety and comfort lay in that direction. "Bollocks! I ain't having none of it. The merchants here are wealthier than most kings, while most of the populace can barely find a penny for a cold one. People die from most any sickness that comes their way. There are pigs that get more learning than most Fontians, and the army's a joke. The city has withstood 100 sieges. Then it's been attacked by 100 idiots. Ain't no trick to take in this city. Just bribe a few guards and waltz on in." The truth of Ak's words slapped Darkelshank's mind open. Ak had built more than muscle in his travels. "I will set the city right. The merchants will stay rich, maybe even get richer. But we can do something for everyone else and turn that bloody militia into a force ready for a fight. You be my copper, and we'll build schools and hospitals and do things that will have people banging on the gates to be part of this." Ak was offering things his royal treasurer had pushed to the back of his mind. He thought of those side streets and their barely heard stories. What would it be like to extend a hand down those routes? There was money in the city to do this, sure enough, and Darkelshank glimpsed grandeur in the mission. But there was danger there too, sharp knives hovering behind their backs. Yes, Your Majesty, that seems like quite the dream. I fear... Bollocks! Dreams are for losers. We're putting together a plan. The way I see it, we can either appeal to the people and scare the money men, or we can cuddle up to the rotten traitors. You see any other way? Darkelshank's breathing came in staccato bursts, inhaling every second or two and not quite clearing his lungs on the exhales. Your Majesty, I don't see another way, but between those two I definitely recommend an alliance with the merchants. Well, put your rudden mind to it. For now, we're in a rush, so we'll do both. We'll be everybody's pal. We'll woo the merchants right enough, but we'll give them a little scare while we're at it. Those buggers will see the wisdom in sliding a little coin to the common good. Darkelshank wondered when it had become we. We were on the edge of dying. He forced his breath to slow and remembered he had a choice. There did not have to be a we, nor did he have to betray this brave fool. He could leave Fund. And Darkelshank, I want to let you know I right respect the trick you played with the fortune teller. Bloody brilliant, really. I'm not sure anyone other than me would take it that way, but I know genius when I see it. As Darkelshank's face fell, Ock reached out a hand to put it on the royal treasurer's shoulder. Don't worry, mate. I ain't turning on you. You've got the inside scoop, and I need you at that. I'm an outsider here. Been an outsider everywhere. And I think you're a bit of an outsider, too. I've learned a few things about you in the past fortnight. Your bosses tolerate you because you're sharp. You do a good job. That's been me, too. But from what I'm hearing, you've never got respect. We're going to fix that. I need all that sharpness you've got inside you. What do you say? There was no running away for Darkelshank. He was a dead man if the Merchant Council found him out. They'd hire assassins who would hunt him down wherever he went. Darkelshank looked in Ock's eyes and saw no mockery, only an offer of friendship and a promise of glory. But friendship would not stop assassins' blades. How? Darkelshank whispered. How what? How are you going to protect us, you and me? Ain't looked out today, have you? Palace is ringed with soldiers, a mixture of militia and babes in arms. Not much of a force, but better than what any merchant can put together. Don't you worry about knives in the back. I'll make sure you always got guards around. How will you stop the Merchant Council from running you out of town? Well, I don't reckon that'll be too difficult. A bunch like that don't hang together well. Anyway, not all of them are important. Main thing I've got to do is find something that scares them more than I do. And I got a couple ideas there too. But what do you think? You got the inside hand here? Darkelshank's breath followed easily as he arrived at the problem he'd spent much of the past 2 years pondering. There really are only 5 members of the Merchant Council who matter. If you can keep them split, they won't move on you. But what sort of threat are you talking about? 2 I spot off the bat. There's bandits eating into the profits, and I can fix that for them. But the biggest threat is the other 500,000 Funtians that the merchants have been screwing over for as long as anyone can remember. I've been wetting a few whistles, and they're fixing to get right restless. Our lovely merchants are about to experience their first general strike, and they won't care for it. We can keep everyone happy, but if the merchants get rid of us, all hell will break loose, and you can bet the money grubbers will figure that out. I ain't gonna mouth off and threaten them. Won't have to. Thoughts tornadoed through Darkelshank's mind. Ock was restless, but the scheme wasn't out of the question. Ock was even missing one of the Merchant Council's weaknesses. They were ridiculously jealous of each other and could be separated with a deft touch. King and Royal Treasurer could make this work. They needed to whisper in the right ears and come up with a few innocuous fees which would fund their start. The former bookkeeper knew where to find money at the margins of those ledgers and which tax collectors could be safely replaced. Mate, you may not see it, but there's a lot like us. Little people who ain't got a chance, treated as if they don't count. Now that I've had a break, it's only fair that they get a shot. What do you say? You in? That was when Darkelshank saw that he wasn't the cleverest man in fun, but he might just be that man's true cobbler. Thank you for listening to my story. Bless you. May you be blessed with friendship, companions who make you better, sometimes helping you, sometimes accepting your gifts. God bless. Have a great day.